Yeah, just heads up.
I'll keep my mouth as clean as possible.
Yeah, I don't know how far you can go in talking about throwing, but
Sounds about right.
so yeah, just okay. Folks are streaming in. All right, can you just check to make sure that you do have access to screen sharing?
Yeah.
Sweet. All right, welcome everybody. My name's Jude Loren. I'm the youth director at Disc Northwest. Actually, sorry, I'm the interim executive director at Disc Northwest. That's going to take some getting used to. I'm the youth director in my heart. I'm really excited about today's presentation and really appreciate Ella's interest and willingness to be a part of this. Ella was one of the first folks I thought of when we were doing this, when we were planning these workshops. Ella has been coaching for a long time, despite their young age, and I've always been impressed with the thoughtfulness that Ella has brought to teaching Ultimate. I think sometimes it's hard for somebody who's been playing from a very young age to be able to teach well because things come so naturally, where they have so much kind of, they're just like, just do this. But Ella is very thoughtful in her approach to coaching, and is honestly just one of the best pure throwers in the game. So no one better to do this. So I'm gonna hand it over to Ella and sit back and hopefully become a better thrower myself.
Well, thank you, Jude. Can everybody see? This is a classic Zoom question. I'm trying to get. Is it full screen for people, or is it just like the? Anybody?
It's showing your notes page version of it.
Good. That's definitely what I want. Well, I don't have any notes, but let's hold on. I'm a young person. I know how to do tech. Okay, can you, is it full screen now, anybody? You got this?
No, still the notes page.
Oh, good.
Click on display settings at the top. You might be able to change it right up there.
Okay. Well,
Do you have an external monitor on?
I do.
Yeah, you want to make sure you have it so it says duplicate, and then you should be fine.
Oh, great.
Do you know how to switch that?
Yeah.
How's everyone doing today? Oh, there we go. Never mind.
Woohoo! Okay, well, if you have a disc nearby you, you should go grab it. Start with that. You can go grab it. If I will happily wait if you need some time to grab a disc. I have one. Let me just pull up my notes really quick here. Okay, so if you have a disc, I would say go ahead and just hold it, grab it like like you're gonna throw, and just take a look at what your grips look like. And if you feel like that's something that you know how to teach to people. So just a quick overview of me, I guess. Jude kind of introduced me, but I started playing Ultimate in middle school in Seattle, and I've been playing since then for almost 12 years now. I played for Oregon Fugue, Portland Schwa, and am currently a throwing coach for Oregon Fugue, as well as the executive director of Eugene Middle School Ultimate. And then, let's see, we'll look at our disc grip. My overall throwing philosophies, I try to think of throwing as like a chain reaction. So all the parts of your body from your feet to your fingers can generate power and touch on your ultimate throws and are important aspects of the full throw. I think that teaching throwing is challenging because you have to break down old habits to build up new ones. And with so many different people learning throwing from just doing it or from being taught by people who haven't necessarily like learned proper mechanics themselves, it can be challenging to do that because it tends to feel like regression at first. And I think it's important to keep working through that and understanding that it's not going to get, your form isn't going to become perfect in a day or get fixed in a day. Or your goals are not going to be necessarily achieved extremely quickly. And when I work with throwers, I really try to look for examples of correct form and call that out positively, as well as like nudge them in the right direction in terms of focuses. Like if I'm working with somebody on one certain focus and I see them do a throw, for example, without very much wrist snap, and we're working on wrist snap, that's something that I would say, hey, like remember to use your wrist, snap your wrist, just as a gentle reminder, and try to make it as positive as possible, because I think a lot of people will be like, I should have done that. I'm mad at myself. But just making it positive and reminding folks that, you know, I'm not expecting them to be perfect the whole time, but I methods, some drills, and then talk about pulling specific work. So let's see, talk about mechanics first. In general, we want to have an efficient motion with minimal energy loss. We want to stay balanced throughout our body when we're pivoting and getting ready to throw, and be powerful using our whole body power and all of our, from legs, torso, and arm. And then there are a couple of more specific mechanics that I like to focus on, like dropping shoulders to change arm angles rather than like trying to tilt the disc. And then grip. So let's see, we'll talk about efficiency. So all parts of your throwing motion are connected, generating power from your legs into your torso, into your shoulder, into your elbow, into your wrist, and into your hand, all bring together and create a very strong throwing motion. And in terms of rotation, I like to think about focusing as much on a forward motion as possible, rather than more rotational or up and down. I see a lot of players when they throw really forcefully, they kind of throw it more up. And that is relatively inefficient because we want the disc to go forward, and you can kind of adjust your angles with wrist a little bit, as well as I've seen a lot of players who will throw kind of rotating their whole body and bringing the disc around in a circle almost, or in an arc. And I really like to focus on having the disc go in a straight path towards your goal or your target, and sort of rotating your body around it. And then one thing that I find has helped a lot of people, and was kind of surprising, honestly, that this way of explaining it was clear to people, but kind of going from a straight to bent to straight motion. So reaching back straight, and then coming through elbow bent, and then releasing straight. And then minimizing unnecessary flourishes. So I think, especially for younger players, well, all players really, but some tend to have flourishes like you're coming to throw and you like flip the disc up. Oh, it keeps going away. Well, flip the disc up and then bring it through for your motion. And these things, the more parts of your motion you have, the more opportunities there are to have inconsistencies or potentially, mess something up and kind of screw up your throwing. So trying to minimize that as much as possible will really help with creating more consistency in throwing, and also create more power because you aren't losing power through those things. So we're gonna watch Gina Cartagena throw some backhands. She's a very efficient thrower. Yeah. She has very minimal flourishes in her motion and brings the disc through really straight. And you can see she kind of reaches back straight there and then pulls through bent and finishes her arm out straight. That's kind of a good shot of it. You can see her arm is straight right there, comes through bent, finishes straight. And again, she has like very few inefficiencies in her motion, and just very powerful thrower. All right. The second part is going to be balance. I think a lot of folks don't necessarily think about pivoting in terms of generating power as much as just moving your body to a position where you can throw around a mark. And I like to think about it kind of as a cut, as a change of direction. When I push off, if I'm standing in a forehand stance and I push off of my right foot, righty forehand, to throw a backhand around break or something, I'm pushing off as if I'm changing direction, as if I'm cutting, because that generates me power in my rotational, rotationness. And sorry, I scooted forward a little bit. All right. And again, yeah, using pivots and fakes to generate power, pushing off of your non-pivot foot, both for backhands and forehands, can really give a lot of power to a thrower. And then quickness, being able to pivot in any direction at any point. Obviously, if you are in the mid, like about to throw or have just released, you don't necessarily have to pivot somewhere else. But I think the best throwers are able to quickly look for a throw and then you move quickly to throw another throw. Let me try to take a look at my settings so that it, go. Okay. And we're gonna watch this video of Mike Ing throwing forehands. He is a very balanced thrower, and you can kind of see he's very springy and just looks very balanced as he throws these, ready to pivot back any way he wants and generating a lot of power from his legs. All right. And then moving on to power. I like to be really intentional with this and get folks to engage their legs, glutes, and abs specifically. I think as people learn how to throw, kind of think just about throwing with your arm and your upper body and not as much about using your lower body. And I find that engaging those things creates more consistency in throws and more power and more stability and a ability to throw further consistency without having to try as hard, which kind of creates more consistency because you're not overexerting yourself. And then again, talking about the straight line, quickest way from A to B is a straight line. And so we want to be using our rotational power, but also having the disc go in a straight line and making that as efficient as possible. For forehands, I like to talk about how full power is not always best. I think people tend to kind of overthrow forehands, especially hand huck. And I find that throwing at 80% power, practicing that, or even 50% power, depending on what the issue is, can be really helpful. And I usually use this when I feel like somebody is kind of like turning over their forehands. So having them kind of fall outside in when they're throwing, having them build up more from a trying to throw at that same distance, but with less effort is super helpful. And I find people tend to actually just throw it further, throwing it at 80% because they're actually using their mechanics and not just trying to force the disc where they want it to go. And we're gonna watch Valeria Cardenas throwing some forehands. And she just throws with so much power and so much ease. You can just see her wrist snap and how efficient her motion is going forward. She has very minimal flourishes with the disc or the forehand. She just basically brings it back and throws. All right, so talking about grip, I think grip is something that's controversial. I know a lot of folks like to teach the kind of K grip to beginners. I personally prefer teaching the power grip, the elite thrower grip, as I'm demonstrating here. But grips also can vary from person to person what works best for them. So in general, I like to think of what can provide the best combo of power and touch. So I know a lot of folks feel like they get more touch from doing the K grip or the split grip on the forehand, and more touch throwing a high release backhand or a short backhand with their finger on the rim. And I think that's fine. In general, I would prefer to teach folks the most efficient ways. And I think in terms of hand size or gripping ability, I know a lot of throwers with very small hands that can successfully do the elite grip. So I think that having small hands isn't necessarily a negative on that. but it just takes repetition and practice, and it definitely can be painful at first. You just have to strengthen up your hand muscles to be able to throw and hold it like that. I think that's the most efficient grip, and I think if you do it enough, you can easily have a lot of control and stability with it. You just need to practice. And in terms of the backhand, I just use a pretty traditional grip, 4 fingers under. My first finger is kind of like under the rim a little bit, and my other 3 fingers have the pads down on the top of the disc, and my thumb on the flight rings. All right. In terms of teaching methods, I like to stay as simple as possible and give 1 to 3 focuses per throw, so per backhand or per forehand. And many of these focuses can actually be applied to both forehands and backhands, whether it's keeping the disc flat through your motion and not flipping it up the end, or trying to throw it as straight as possible, or throw with a lot of wrist snap, or dropping your shoulder down to throw insides. Focuses also really depend on the person. So I sometimes like to go through kind of different focuses and see what resonates with the person, have them focus on each thing, throw a couple throws, and see if they kind of get it or it makes a difference. And so sometimes I'll give a player multiple focuses and then figure out what works for them, and then have them really think about and focus on the things that worked for them. I like to be really intentional with throwing. I think that being intentional in any practice is a benefit, but especially when working on throwing and trying to learn potentially new form, it's very helpful to be intentional and to really focus on your goals as you go through. If you're being lackadaisical and just kind of tossing around, you're not really going to improve your form in that way. And obviously, lots of repetitions is great. And trying to revisit the same thing as often as possible. I think it's hard if you do it once a week. People don't necessarily feel like they're making progress, or maybe they'll make progress within a given throwing session and then lose that progress later. And then the last thing is that some people like to learn about how the discs fly. Personally, I really like learning about that, and I find like that learning about that has helped me be a better thrower and teach throwing better. But not everyone really appreciates that, which is totally fine. So that can be a good tool to use for players who are interested in that or curious, but it's not necessarily something that I explain to every single person I work with. So we're going to talk about some drills that I like to use when I'm throwing or teaching throwing. I like to isolate the upper body by kneeling and then doing no pivot throws, and then some wind throwing focuses, some forehand isolation focuses, and then some pivoting focuses. So the first one is an upper body ISO. I really like throwing from knees. I like having people do that. I think very often people try to use their pivots and it tends to be kind of a distraction almost on the throwing form. So getting back to basics, I like to throw just from my knees. You can throw short, long, whatever you want. Ideally, this would probably be done with a partner or a target, but you can throw to no one in the middle of a park like I did. And rotating your upper body as much as you want is totally fine. and we want to be able to generate power from that. But you obviously still want to be on your knees. And then, oh, it's playing the video again. We will take a look at what that looks like for forehands. I actually find this to be easier with forehands because it's a much more of an upper body focused movement. Focus a lot on your arm snap and your wrist snap. And this is something that you can do, start short, build up, try to throw longer and longer. And most people should be able to throw 40 yards from your knees with just upper body power. And then from there, I usually like to progress to a no pivot throwing. So this kind of lets you use a little more of your lower body power without actually pivoting. And the kind of motion that I'm using there, like I'm really leaning over into my pivot foot or into my non-pivot foot for a forehand. And that's generally like this, almost the same form I'll use for throwing. I just use my legs to generate more power. And then another drill I like to use is wind throwing. I use this to work on throwing power in the wind. I think, yeah, a lot of people tend to be scared of the wind, and I really like to think of it as a fun tool that you can add to your tool belt. And so when I do this, I have people throw it as far inside out as possible, ideally focusing on having the disc at as close to a 90 or perpendicular to the ground as possible when you release, because this kind of the form you want when you're throwing, especially into the wind. And these throws are going to be weird. They're not really going to look that good unless you are really throwing into the wind, and that's fine. We're just, for this, working on the form, and this is a good way to work on throwing in the wind if you don't have any wind. And we'll take a look at that for forehands. This is a little easier to get it more perpendicular to the ground. And really focusing on dropping the shoulder. I really like to think about tipping my torso over and dropping my arm and shoulder down as I throw, not thinking about rotating the disc as much. I prefer my throwers keep the disc in line with your forearm. So the plane of the disc should be aligned with the angle of your forearm. And you shouldn't really be adjusting that. When we talk about like throwing inside, we really want to like use our body and our arm, because that generates more power as we can like just kind of tilt our system over, rather than like creating an inefficiency where I'm dropping the disc down and only really using the power from my wrist to throw a forehand or a backhand. When I'm focusing on isolating the forehand, if I feel like somebody isn't, I usually use this drill if somebody isn't as good as with forehand snap or is trying to focus on that. And this can be done, I'm going to demonstrate throwing a high release flick focus. This can be done as a just a regular isolated flick. So going to your regular position that you would throw, stopping, and then just throwing with wrist snap from there. I like the high release flick because I think it really intentionally focuses on just getting you to focus on your wrist snap. But if you're working with a middle schooler or somebody who you don't necessarily want to be throwing high release flicks in games, that's totally fine. And it's a great opportunity to throw just isolated regular flick. I will say, want to make sure that when you do that, you aren't locking in your elbow. This is an issue I see with a lot of people, is teaching keeping your elbow in and close to your body and then just throwing with your wrist. I really am not a fan of that. It really minimizes your overall throwing power and just kind of limits it to like your upper torso rotation and then your wrist. When I throw, I like to think about leading with my shoulder, then my elbow, then my wrist, then my finger snap. And you can see I just go up and snap the disc. And these don't really have to be super forceful or far, just working on getting the snap, trying to keep the disc as flat as possible throughout the throw. And then we'll talk about pivoting. So focusing on pivots, I like to do this drill to practice throwing pivoting far out consistently. It's pretty simple. Just set up 3 cones, pivot from the middle cone, and set up these cones at about the distance that you would be throwing a pretty far step out throw. And then just throw around. Make sure you're stepping past the cone each time. And this can be a really cool example too for players to sort of see how big their reach is as a thrower, and how far they can use their fakes and throws to move their mark. And I really like it as a tool for really showing, especially youth players, what their actual reach is. All right, now we're going to talk about pulling. So I really like to break this down into lots of parts. Pulling almost is a different throw because you can generate so much power without having a pivot foot and being able to run up. And I think just doing lots of reps, as well as all the other throws, but doing lots of reps is really helpful for this. So I like to start super broken down and then build up to a full rep of throwing or pulling from there. So I start stationary. I like to pull with an X step, and this is the last part of the X step. I like to think about trying to be a full 180 degrees away, turned away from where I'm throwing to. And this, I'll start with just pulling through, doing that. And then the next step would be adding 1 step and throwing. And then the next step would be 2 steps. These would go through as you feel really comfortable throwing at each level of these before you progress to the next one. And it can be good to kind of like test it out and try to do a full power run up. But I would generally say try to focus on doing the whole, focus on doing the parts as you go through. In terms of getting reps on this, I like to use a net, like a soccer goal or any sort of net you have, and or your player has, and just do those reps, especially starting with just the stationary, reps right into a net, and work on the specific form there, again, of like pulling the disc straight through rather than rotating it, and really getting power and hip rotation coming through before you even move out onto the field. And we can see some improvements from Dozer. We've been working on our pulling. So this was one of the first pulls that we were working on. And as you can see, she's kind of throwing it high, not necessarily bringing all the power through with the X step. And if we look at her now, she's doing a good job of turning her body all the way around and then getting full rotation coming through there. And really keeping the disc flat and bringing it through with a lot of power. Okay, so I think the main takeaways and focuses I try to think about when I'm teaching throwing is to focus on one thing at a time and kind of generalizing things rather than saying things like saying getting a lot of rotation on your flicks, that will help, but focusing more on getting that wrist snap or doing those forehand isolation drills, focusing on one thing at a time and then building on that skill to the next one. Again, focusing on creating an efficient system. The more efficient your throwing system is, the better your throws will be and the more consistent they will be, and focusing on intentional practice. So I like to have players have intentional throwing time every practice. And I think that's super helpful. I like to sometimes pair people up in terms of like giving them throwing partners. We did this on Fugue for the season. They were able to kind of hold each other accountable, share their goals, and they would throw with each other each practice, allowing them to kind of watch each other and critique each other and gain those skills that way rather than having to be worked with one-on-one. But I also really like working with people one-on-one, especially for figuring out what focuses they want to have or they should have or are helpful for them, and also teaching new skills. But I think that working in pairs is really helpful in terms of practicing those skills rather than necessarily learning the skills. Yeah, thanks for listening. If you have questions, I would really love to answer them or hear them. If you want advice on teaching throwing or on your pulling form or throwing form, please email me. I would love to hear it. A lot of the video in here was from the Ultiworld's Elite Throwing Form archive, which is on YouTube, and a super good resource to watch a lot of throwers and see how they throw. I would really encourage filming yourself and comparing it with those elite throwers, or just being able to sort of see your progress and how you can create an efficient system, and filming whoever you're working with. I find that is really helpful because then they can see what they're doing and they can understand it more and kind of connect what they're seeing with what they're feeling as they throw. And then just practice coaching people. I always, if I'm throwing with somebody, I always ask them if they want to work on skills, but I never, just go out of the blue and say, you need to start doing this. But it's really good practice to work with friends and your kids or whoever you have, in order to kind of see what works well and what techniques are effective for teaching throwing for you. If you have questions, I think you can raise your hand. I can't see people's faces. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But feel free to ask questions. Got some chat questions. Sam, are you raising your hand? Go ahead, ask a question.
I was wondering if you had either like a specific warm-up you like to use or like some things to keep in mind that you should be warming up before you start throwing. Do you just, show up to practice, you start throwing, and then people end up like, I don't know, I feel like I at least haven't warmed up things that I need. I don't know what that is though.
Yeah, I generally like to, I think I'm maybe not the best example, but I generally warm up my throwing kind of by throwing, and then doing like some basic plyos and mobility stuff. I know some people feel like they have to get like a full body warm up in before they throw to feel comfortable and safe, and that's also great. I think there aren't necessarily specific warm up things that I do that would be separate um, from ultimate warm-ups, but I would say actually you can kind of look to disc golf if you are curious and are looking for more throwing warm-ups, because a lot of the motions are very similar and they only throw things. They don't do the running part. So they probably have a good good setup for getting a good warm-up in for just throwing. Okay, Win is asking, can I walk through some of the most common mistakes among beginner players and how you've worked to correct them? Yeah, I think one of the most common mistakes, as I said before, I think is having like little flourishes or like folks who like kind of flip the disc up as they go through their throwing. And for that, I just like to really break down the throwing motion. Starting from the reach back and then through the motion, and having them start without doing their like motion reach back, just starting with the reach back, starting stationary there, and then working on their throws, and then sort of adding back in the routine. And I think especially for that, that can be a frustrating thing to work through because those things are so ingrained in people. But let's see if there are any other common beginner mistakes that I see. I think just focusing on sort of getting the whole chain of throwing in. I think as a beginner, it's really challenging to use your whole body for the throw. And working on kind of snapping your wrist and then using your arm for power and then also using your torso and your legs and all of that. So I really like, I like to have people focus on making the motion as smooth as possible and as connected as possible and trying to minimize any hitches that they have or pauses. And by doing like I kind of talked about with pulling, breaking it down into just the few motions and making sure that then you can build them back together. So starting with the pull through and then reach back and pull through and then pivot, reach back and pull through. And then maybe fake pivot, reach back and pull through, just sort of building it up from the bottom up.
Hi, I had a quick question. I have been working with a few different players that one of them only has the ability to move one arm. So they're actually throwing lefty and
Okay.
they can't move their other arm, which I've noticed tends to kind of stop their throwing motion a little bit or the momentum. And I was wondering if you had any tips to help with that.
Yeah, I think that's a interesting thing to work with. I have not worked with throwers who have only moved one arm, so I don't have any firsthand experience with that. And I definitely think a lot of throwers tend to use their off arm kind of to generate power as they throw. What I would think of is just really focusing on getting like a stable grip. And so if that means like using the split grip or the K grip like this, that could be really helpful. And I think focusing on having the disc go in a straight line, I think that to me also generates a lot of power. Yeah, those are the things I can think of off the top of my head, but I would be also interested in talking about it more and thinking about it more. I got another question. Can I talk a little bit about how I teach players to throw with edge, both short and long throws? I love talking about throwing with edge. I think a lot of this has to do with wrist snap. And then I kind of like to differentiate between power and touch on throws. So power being trying to throw with full power. And then I like to think about like a touch throw as a throw that floats so gently to your target, and if they weren't there, if they didn't catch it, it would just fall on the ground right where they're standing. And I think that a lot of learning how to throw with edge is practice, and I think that's true of a lot of things, but really thinking about your shoulder angle too, especially, I think is really important. I think a lot of people, when they think about throwing with edge, think about adjusting their wrist. And so again, like focusing on like dropping your shoulder or pulling your shoulder really up to throw like a bladey flick. I like to think about it more like that, because I think that really allows you to throw throws with edge with power as well, and not just using your wrist, but using your whole body. Anybody else have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, Kelsey?
Okay. So pulling question. So last year I actually tore my ACL while I was pulling because on the last part of the step, basically my plant foot didn't rotate because it got stuck in the ground. Do you have thoughts or tips on how you transition from like torquing that much with your whole body, basically? Like, do you know if that plant foot for you like comes off of the ground, or if it's usually something that slides on the ground?
What do you mean by come off of the ground? I think like
in some like watching games and stuff when they're showing people who are pulling, like I don't know if it's intentional or not, but some people there's like kind of a little hop that happens like as they're finishing that rotation.
I think I do the hop a little bit. I do think, yeah, that sucks, first of all, and is scary. I find that people tend to kind of like have the ingrained like I have to pivot with a pivot foot as I throw, and so it's hard to kind of release yourself to, it's okay to like have your body fully follow through, especially if you're trying to run down on the pull. I really try to let my body like completely follow through, and sometimes I really end up like way facing the wrong direction. But yeah, I think for keeping your body safe, I think that is super important. And I guess I could talk more about generating power. I think in my pulling motion, I really start, or as I go through, there's a point where I have like all of my weight and power on my back foot, and then as I'm pulling through, I bring all of that onto my front foot, and that can definitely be scary. But yeah, I think being able to complete that rotation makes sense to me. I don't know if that was helpful in any way.
Ella, can I say one thing as a
Yes.
as a post ACL also polar?
Yes.
Kelsey, I think like the first step that Ella was talking about, where there's just a stationary practicing with how you're holding the disc and how you're following through without like fully rotating and getting the shape and power there, I think can be the step that leads to like less people trying to put so much torque on their lower body. If you really get the shape and the power from like your hips and your arm and the whole like kind of upper chain, when you can like do that first step that Ella like showed, then I think that it leads to people doing less on their knees. I also try to teach people, and I try to do it where I'm more on the ball of my foot and not flat footed, so that when I'm twisting, it's a smaller point of like contact with the ground than a full flat foot. As two things that I changed after tearing my ACL and continuing to pull.
Thank you very much. Mara says, I'm confused about the forehand isolation drill you described. Could I re-explain the drill? Yes, absolutely. So I can show a little better too. When I'm throwing, I can't even see, I'm just gonna remove my background. You don't need to see that. Yeah, so when I'm throwing, focusing on the forehand isolation, I like to either have people throw a high release because it really focuses on that wrist snap. This is more for folks who I feel like aren't necessarily get wrist snap, or kind of like throwing it just with their body and letting it kind of fly that way. So I like to throw the high release flick. I think it's really challenging for folks. And if it's too challenging, that's totally fine. And the other option would be to throw like with just your arm extended, isolated. So I would say like, all right, go to where you're about to start your forward motion for throwing a flick, and then hold there and just snap rather than going through the full motion. And then the other thing I was saying was don't lock the elbow in, because that is really limiting in terms of your power and getting that throwing. So I like to lead with my shoulder, elbow, wrist, hand. And so this isolates more of the like wrist motion, and then you can kind of add elbow, wrist, and then shoulder, elbow, wrist, and then you can kind of build from there. Does that make it more clear?
Yeah, thanks. And then one more question. It's probably easier to explain.
Yeah.
I teach high school girls, and I find a lot of them really struggle with like releasing it flat. Like a lot of them are very bladey, and like, how do you teach them how to like throw it flatter?
One of my favorite analogies, I don't know if it's analogy, examples, I guess, is to think about knocking a bunch of stuff off a table. If you have like a table with a bunch of dishes and things, and you just want to knock all of it off with your disc. So kind of like that brings for the like throwing efficiently and having the disc more flat. And then I will say, like, talking about how the disc flies, the more wind the disc gets, the more it wants to go outside in and tail off, the more air it touches, I guess. So whether that's like throwing into the wind, as you can like see a lot of people, if they throw into the wind, they tend to like tail off and blade out. So for flicks especially, if you go back and watch like the Cardenas twins throwing flicks, you can see that as they release, if they're throwing a flat flick, they really are releasing it. This is a bad example because I'm going to stand up. They really are releasing it like this, with the angle of the disc more down, because it flips up to flat as it goes through the air. So I think focusing on, and that's true for backhands as well, but I think it's more pronounced in forehands. Giving a little bit of inside out angle will actually help the disc fly flat and have that shape as a throw. Any other questions? Oh, Spencer, hello. Spencer says, on the subject of ACL stuff, when you're stepping out for backhand, what's the angle of your foot doing the stepping? Is your toe pointing at the target? That's a great question. I think it depends on the thrower. I personally like to teach keeping your body in as line with itself as possible. So trying to have your toes pointing where your hips are pointing, because that is how your body mechanics want to move. And for both backhands and forehands, I know some really, really good throwers who don't do that. But I also think in terms of teaching mechanics, I would say leaning towards keeping, like your toes and your feet in line with how your body's moving. So if I'm stepping out to throw on a round backhand, but I'm throwing, like if you put my body in a line with where my legs are, I would be kind of throwing perpendicularly to where my body is. I would want my toes to be in line with where my legs are and my body is, even if I'm not throwing in that direction. Kind of just like you're doing a lunge, like for a workout.
Hi, I had another quick question. If you have you ever experienced or helped out with a player, or have any advice for a player who maybe had some nerve damage, and can't feel their tricep anymore or some muscles in their shoulder? I'm looking on ways to build strength back up in other muscle groups I can still actually feel.
I have not worked with any players with that. And I'm not super sure how that would affect throwing. I guess I don't necessarily think that intentionally about those muscles, but also clearly they are a part of the throwing motion. I would say like focusing on like engaging your core and your glutes and your legs and your hamstrings and your quads and all of your core power areas, I think will help minimize the strain and on your arm, and allow you to sort of get more power and consistency without kind of focusing on just the arm throwing part.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Claire says, when you're pulling in the wind or looking to get it to a certain place on the field, how does your form change? Is the run up the same? No, my form changes a lot based on what the wind is. So as I showed with the really steep inside out backhands and forehands, the IOs for working in the wind, when I pull into the wind, I try to pull with the disc like as close to perpendicular to the ground as possible, because again, it does do that. Like if I release it like this, it's gonna flip up like this when it's going into the wind, and often it'll flip over like that too. And yeah, so when I am throwing into the wind, I try to do that as much as possible. I also like to throw, depending on the situation, especially playing zone, like to throw rollers out the sideline. And so that was pretty different with a lot more edge on the disc. I try to release it around here. And I'll do that upwind too, depending on what the situation is or how windy it is or where the wind's coming from. And then my form definitely changes going downwind. I generally like bring the disc through a lot higher, but I kind of keep my torso and my arm up higher. I don't necessarily like change where the disc is in relation to my throwing form. I think my throwing form, I naturally kind of throw it up pretty close to my shoulder height, but I'll like lean my torso over and drop my shoulder relative if I want to throw that inside. And then I'm keeping the same kind of angle and mechanics. If I'm throwing downwind, I'll throw generally more outside in and try to get to blade and be as hard to catch or field as possible, depending on the wind. Yeah. But yes, my form definitely does change. In terms of the run up, I think generally pretty much the same. I still try to do the X step, but the X step, it's a lot easier to do throwing more of an outside in pull downwind because I'm not necessarily having to contort my body as much and trying to get the disc to sort of come through in that straight line as much. I can kind of let my arm be like the pendulum rotational device more throwing downwind because that's naturally, it's going to hold its, it's going to hold its edge more going downwind. Anybody else got a question? Great.
Guess you covered it all.
Yeah, feel free to email me. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I sent it just to Jude. Hold on. Got to figure this out. I will happily share my slides. I can just put the file in here and you can download it really quick if you want.
So if you can send it to me, I can make it available, create a link to it on
Perfect. On your website. Cool. That works great for me. Yeah. Feel free to email me if you have questions or you want to work on your form. I love working with people.
Thanks, Ella. Are you, is that something that like, do you have a Venmo where people could like drop you some cash for some help, for some feedback?
Sure. Yeah, I'm super down to do that. I've never had somebody pay me for it before, but if you want, I'll happily take it.
Don't give away your expertise like that, except for I did ask you to do this for free. But yeah, thanks, Ella. That was awesome. I really appreciate it. If you want to be able to share it with folks within your community, it's on the YouTube page already.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Deirdre, I saw that. I'll hang out. Awesome. Thanks all. Stay safe.
You too. Bye.
Wash your hands.
Yes.
Hey, Jude.
Hey.
So we're doing a call tonight with our players on all three.